So imagine for a moment that you are just handed the keys to a kingdom, but this kingdom is actively tearing itself apart.
Oh, man. Yeah, just absolute chaos everywhere.
Exactly. You're standing in the rubble of a collapsed society or maybe a shattered organization, and suddenly you are given absolute unchecked power to rebuild it.
Right. And every single decision you make from that exact moment forward will either save thousands of people or entirely ruin them.
The pressure is just suffocating. I mean, the biological temptation to just like build a fortress for yourself, secure your own survival, and let the rest burn, it's overwhelming.
It really is. It's the ultimate diagnostic test of the human ego, honestly.
And that is exactly what we're diving into today. Today's deep dive is opening up a profoundly dense 150-year-old esoteric blueprint.
Yeah, it explains exactly how a human mind survives that kind of pressure,
Yeah.
and more importantly, how it resists the gravity of tyranny.
We are looking at Chapter 16 of Albert Pike's foundational 19th century philosophical work, Morals and Dogma. The chapter is titled The Prince of Jerusalem.
And, if you're hearing that and thinking it sounds like some archaic, secret society relic, we really need you to set that preconception aside.
Right, because what we're actually looking at is a rigorous, almost surgical breakdown of the psychology of power. Pike uses this allegory of a prince rebuilding a ruined city to explore the agonizing burden of true leadership.
Absolutely. And to really grasp the gravity of this archetype, the Prince of Jerusalem, we have to locate ourselves in the broader architecture of Pike's philosophy.
Because this isn't just a standalone manifesto, right?
Exactly. It's part of an evolutionary progression of the human character.
Mm.
Like the chapter that immediately precedes this one, The 15th Degree, focuses entirely on personal survival.
Oh, right. The allegory of crossing the river, escaping captivity, and rebuilding yourself after a catastrophic fall.
Yeah. It's deeply intimate internal work. It's the fortification of personal resilience. You really have to do that work first.
It's kind of like the oxygen mask principle on an airplane. You have to secure your own mask before assisting others.
That's a perfect way to put it. You cannot architect a society if your own internal house is collapsing.
I always think about historical figures who were thrust into power before they had conquered their own internal chaos. You look at someone like Nero or even modern autocrats.
Oh, definitely.
They inherit this vast power but possess the emotional regulation of a terrified child. So they just use the state apparatus to soothe their own personal paranoias.
Yeah, and that is the brilliant, logical prerequisite Pike establishes here. You are not permitted to assume the mantle of the prince until you have mastered that internal war.
The night phase, right?
Exactly. But once that foundation of personal resilience is forged, this 16th chapter executes just a terrifying paradigm shift.
We are thrust out of the micro and violently into the macro.
Yes. The question mutates from how do I survive to how do we all survive?
Which, that transition from self-preservation to societal stewardship feels so counter-evolutionary.
It really does.
Biologically speaking, human beings are wired for resource hoarding. Our oldest brain structures tell us that when we acquire power or wealth or leverage, we need to consolidate it to protect our immediate genetic circle.
Right. But Pike's philosophy demands an absolute severing of that biological imperative.
Like a total rewrite of the code.
Exactly. The leader must suppress the instinct for self-preservation entirely in favor of the collective. It's basically a psychological amputation of the ego.
Wow. Amputation is a strong word, but it fits perfectly.
The archetype of the prince is fundamentally incompatible with self-interest. In Pike's framework, the moment you assume authority over others, your life is no longer your own property. It becomes a public utility.
A public utility. That's heavy.
Think about the historical allegory Pike is using here. It's the rebuilding of the Second Temple of Jerusalem after the Babylonian captivity.
So the people are exhausted, traumatized, and deeply divided.
Yes, and the leader who steps into that void cannot be motivated by a desire to see their own face stamped on a coin.
Right, it's not a vanity project.
Not at all. They have to be motivated by the agonizing, unglamorous work of laying bricks for a temple they might not even live to see completed.
That really reframes leadership from a privilege to a profound burden. And I think society desperately struggles with this today.
Oh, without a doubt. We get it so wrong.
We have this pervasive, almost toxic cultural narrative that equates climbing the ladder with arriving at some kind of VIP lounge. The higher you go, the softer the cushions, the better the perks.
Yeah, the corner office mentality.
Exactly. But this esoteric blueprint argues that the higher you go, the colder and more treacherous the environment becomes. You aren't walking into a penthouse.
You're stepping into a high-pressure boiler room.
Yes. And you alone are responsible for keeping the entire structure from freezing.
And we witnessed the catastrophic fallout when leaders failed to internalize that burden. You know, when a leader views their authority as a mechanism for personal enrichment or ego gratification, the entire ecosystem begins to cannibalize itself.
Like a founder who starts a company in a garage. At first, it's all about personal survival.
Right. But once they have 500 employees, the leadership role fundamentally changes. If they still treat it like a personal piggy bank, the company rots from the inside out.
We see it in the decay of massive corporations all the time, where executives hollow out the company's long-term viability for a short-term stock buyout.
Or in nation-states where public treasuries are treated as personal slush funds.
Exactly. The philosophy here is unambiguous. When a public responsibility is treated as a private fiefdom, it ceases to be leadership and devolves into parasitic exploitation.
So the prince must view their power purely as a tool for the collective good.
Yes, which requires a daily, grueling subjugation of their own desires.
Okay, so let's say a leader actually manages that psychological amputation. They conquer their ego. They genuinely want to serve the greater good and rebuild the city.
That's step one.
Right. But the terrifying reality is that good intentions are utterly insufficient. I mean, history is littered with leaders who genuinely believed they were serving the greater good while architecting absolute atrocities. The road to hell is paved with altruistic delusions.
Exactly. So, what is the actual mechanism? How does the Prince of Jerusalem execute this vision without becoming a tyrant convinced of their own righteousness?
That is the pivotal question, and Pike's answer is unapologetically rigid. The engine of this governance, the only buffer against the leader's own self-righteous tyranny, is objective justice.
Okay, wait, I have to push back on that a little bit.
Go for it.
Because leaning on justice feels incredibly precarious. If I look at this through, like, a Machiavellian lens, or go all the way back to Plato's Republic and the arguments of Thrasymachus.
Ah, right, the advantage of the stronger.
Yeah, exactly. Isn't justice merely the advantage of the stronger? Throughout human history, the person sitting on the throne defines what justice means. The victor writes the laws.
And they establish the courts and retroactively justify their violence.
All right. So if the prince has absolute authority, aren't they just constantly redefining justice to suit whatever policy they want to enact that day?
It is a brilliant and necessary pushback. And it's the exact philosophical trap the archetype of the prince is designed to dismantle.
Okay, how so?
Because if justice is subjective, if it bends to the gravity of the leader's ego, then it isn't justice. It is merely force disguised as morality.
Force disguised as morality. I like that.
Pike's philosophy strips away that subjective malleability. In this framework, justice is anchored to universal, immutable truths.
Like what, specifically?
The rigid avoidance of favoritism, the absolute consistency of law, and the unwavering commitment to equity regardless of personal affinity. Power, divorced from this strict kind of justice, is mathematically guaranteed to become abuse.
The consistency aspect is what fascinates me, especially regarding favoritism, because favoritism almost never looks evil from the inside, you know?
Right, it usually masquerades as loyalty.
Exactly. I think about historical monarchs or even just modern political administrations or corporate boards. A leader surrounds themselves with loyalists, the people who protected them during their rise to power.
Yeah, the natural, almost honorable human instinct is to reward that loyalty. You bled for me, so I will protect you.
But the moment a leader shields a loyalist from the consequences of the law, what happens to the architecture of the state?
The architecture crumbles. Because the social contract is voided. This is the insidious nature of inconsistent justice.
Because everyone else is watching.
Exactly. When a society or an organization observes that the rules are elastic, that they bind the common worker but yield for the aristocrat.
Or they punish the dissenting voice but excuse the sycophant.
Right. When that happens, trust evaporates. And without trust, authority loses its legitimacy.
And when legitimacy is lost, the only way to maintain order is through escalating violence or coercion.
Precisely. An unjust system is incredibly expensive to maintain.
Because you're constantly fighting your own people.
Yes. If the citizens or the employees no longer believe in the fairness of the system, they will not willingly participate in it. So the leader has to expend massive amounts of energy and resources just to prevent a revolt.
So true justice, applied with absolute cold consistency, is actually the most efficient form of governance.
It is, because it recruits the willing participation of the governed. The Prince of Jerusalem is tasked with the agonizing duty of punishing their closest friend if they violate the law, while extending absolute protection to their fiercest rival if they are in the right.
Punishing your friend and protecting your rival, that requires a level of emotional detachment that borders on the superhuman.
It really does. It's incredibly difficult.
It makes me think of the concept of the blindfold on the statue of Lady Justice. It's not just that she doesn't see the wealth or status of the person on trial.
Right. She cannot see whether she personally loves or hates them.
But man, applying that level of rigid consistency in the real world is a terrifying tightrope walk. Because the moment you become perfectly rigid, you risk becoming a machine.
And human societies cannot be governed by unfeeling algorithms.
Exactly. Which brings up the eternal tension between authority and leniency, like managing a classroom or parenting. If you're too strict, the kids rebel.
But if you're too lenient, the room devolves into chaos. It's the kinetic center of the entire philosophy. Authority and fairness are often viewed as opposing forces, but Pike insists they must be synchronized.
So the prince has to wield authority because nature abhors a vacuum.
Yes. Without structural authority, human societies inevitably decay into tribal chaos. However, that authority must be meticulously calibrated.
It's the ultimate Goldilocks problem of statecraft. Let's look at the extremes because the dangers are glaring. Let's start with the extreme of absolute rigid authority. You tighten the grip until no one can breathe.
The initial goal might be order, but you invariably breed oppression.
Right, oppression is obvious, but I'm curious about the secondary decay of that. How does an overabundance of strict authority specifically breed corruption?
Because hyper-authoritarian systems are inherently brittle. They fail to account for the complexity of human need. When rules exist primarily to control rather than to protect, they stifle the natural flow of human ingenuity and survival.
Like when every single action is heavily monitored and harshly punished.
Exactly. In a draconian state, the only way for the average person to feed their family or conduct basic business is to subvert the system. Black markets emerge. Bribery becomes the unofficial currency of survival.
So the rigidity of the law actually incentivizes the population to become criminals just to exist.
Yes. Furthermore, extreme authority centralizes power into the hands of an untouchable elite. When a governing class faces no resistance and no oversight, their own ethical boundaries atrophy.
Absolute power doesn't just corrupt the leader, it corrupts the entire societal mechanism.
Right, because it forces everyone to operate in the shadows.
The iron fist creates a nation of smugglers and sycophants, but the pendulum swing is just as lethal, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely. A leader looks at the horrors of a draconian regime or maybe just a toxic micromanager, and they recoil.
They say, I will be the enlightened, compassionate leader. I will rule through grace and ultimate flexibility.
And they drop the reins entirely. But leniency without structure isn't an act of love. It is an abdication of duty.
It's a profound betrayal of the collective. Because when a leader refuses to enforce boundaries out of a misplaced desire to be perceived as benevolent, they just invite disorder.
And who suffers the most in a state of disorder? Not the strong, not the wealthy.
The most vulnerable suffer.
Yes. Without the protective scaffolding of enforced rules, the aggressive and the manipulative will immediately prey upon the weak.
It's the tragedy of the commons. If a community shares a pasture and the leader is too lenient to enforce grazing limits because they don't want to upset anyone, a few greedy individuals will just overgraze their sheep.
The pasture dies, and then everyone starves.
Right. Leniency in the face of exploitation isn't kindness, it's complicity. If a leader allows a toxic employee to repeatedly violate workplace boundaries without consequence, the high-performing, ethical employees will eventually leave in disgust.
Exactly. The individuals who actually abide by the social contract become deeply resentful of the leader who allows others to violate it with impunity.
So the path of the prince is not just a static point on a map.
No, it is an exhausting, dynamic equilibrium. It requires the leader to constantly read the terrain. Does this moment require the firm hand of authority to halt exploitation and restore order? Or does this unique, nuanced situation require the grace of leniency to prevent the law from becoming a blunt instrument of cruelty?
It's not a resting state. It's a constant kinetic hovering. You are constantly making micro adjustments to the left and the right, absorbing new information, and recalibrating.
And that realization smoothly transitions us into the internal mechanics of the leader's mind.
Because to make those millions of micro adjustments without overcorrecting and sending the whole society tumbling into the abyss, a leader needs an incredibly sophisticated internal processor.
Right. They cannot rely on a static rule book. They must rely on wisdom.
And wisdom is the absolute prerequisite for the survival of the prince. Let's pull that apart, because I feel like society uses knowledge and wisdom interchangeably, much to our detriment.
Oh, we definitely do. The esoteric tradition here makes a sharp, vital distinction between knowledge and wisdom. We exist in an era drowning in knowledge but starving for wisdom.
We assume that because someone has an Ivy League degree, a massive data set, and a high IQ, they are wise. But knowledge is simply the accumulation of data points.
Right. Knowledge is reading the quarterly data.
Exactly. Knowledge is looking at a spreadsheet and calculating that automating a factory will save the company $40 million over 5 years. It's math.
But wisdom is something else entirely.
Right. Wisdom is recognizing that gutting the primary employer of a small Midwestern town will decimate the local economy, create generations of poverty, and ultimately result in societal blowback that will cost far more than $40 million. Knowledge sees the immediate transaction, but wisdom sees the historical trajectory.
That is a masterfully accurate distinction. I mean, wisdom is really the contextualization of knowledge, right? It's placing data within the vast, messy web of human consequence.
Yeah, you can't just look at the numbers in a vacuum.
Pike's philosophy structures this wisdom around several core pillars, and the most urgent of these is the capacity for long-term synthesis. Modern leadership is experiencing a systemic crisis of short-termism.
It is a plague. The entire architecture of modern incentive structures is designed to punish long-term thinking.
It really is. A CEO is beholden to the quarterly earnings report.
And a politician is trapped in a relentless 2-year election cycle. If you propose a plan that requires a decade of sacrifice before yielding a harvest, you will be replaced by someone promising a sugar high by Friday.
Yeah. The system demands that leaders strip mine the future to artificially inflate the present.
And that is precisely the temptation the Prince of Jerusalem must violently reject.
The esoteric archetype of building a temple is deeply instructive here. Ancient cathedrals and temples took generations to build.
The stonemason laying the foundation knew unequivocally that they would never see the finished spire.
Exactly. True governance requires planting trees under whose shade you do not expect to sit. It requires the agonizing discipline to look a populace, or a board of directors, in the eye and say, we are going to absorb pain today so that our successors can thrive tomorrow.
But to have the confidence to make those generational bets, you have to be absolutely certain you aren't just hallucinating a future based on your own biases.
That's the catch.
Which brings us to what I consider the most dangerous psychological hazard of power, the echo chamber.
Oh, the echo chamber is terrifying.
Right. As you ascend the hierarchy of power, the air gets thinner and the voices get friendlier. The psychological isolation of apex leadership is just terrifying.
It is a cognitive prison. A leader insulated by sycophants loses their tether to reality.
Because when your entire inner circle is highly incentivized to agree with you, either out of fear of retribution or a desire for proximity to power, your worst ideas are suddenly hailed as genius.
You stop seeing the world through any lens other than your own ego.
I'm reminded of the historical anecdotes of Roman emperors who would wander the streets in disguise just to hear what the commoners were actually saying.
Because they knew everything spoken inside the palace was a sanitized lie.
Exactly. Or, conversely, leaders like Vladimir Putin during the onset of the Ukraine conflict, sitting at the end of a comically long table, physically and psychologically isolated from anyone who might deliver bad news.
When you cut off the flow of dissenting information, you are flying a commercial airliner blind.
So how does the philosophy of the prince construct a mechanism to actively dismantle that echo chamber?
It demands the rigorous practice of empathetic imagination and the intentional solicitation of conflicting perspectives.
Empathetic imagination, I like that.
A decision cannot be considered truly just unless the leader has mentally mapped its impact across every stratum of the society. The prince cannot merely view a policy from the throne. They must view it from the gutter, from the marketplace, and from the borders.
You have to step out of your own consciousness. Like if you are a city planner deciding where to build a new highway, knowledge is looking at the traffic flow algorithms.
Right.
But wisdom is sitting down with the multi-generational families whose homes are in the path of the bulldozer, understanding the cultural heart of the neighborhood you are about to sever, and integrating their grief into your calculus.
It doesn't mean you never build the highway, but it means your decision is anchored in the full spectrum of human reality, not just the sterile math of efficiency.
And integrating those conflicting realities is agonizing work.
It forces the leader to hold profound contradictions in their mind simultaneously, but it is the only way to calibrate the internal compass. Without integrating multiple perspectives, a leader is merely projecting their own neuroses onto the world and calling it statecraft.
Okay, so let's construct our hypothetical prince up to this point. They have subjugated their biological urge to hoard power. They are administering cold, consistent justice. They are dynamically balancing the tightrope of authority and grace. They are thinking in centuries rather than quarters, and they are actively dismantling their own echo chambers to synthesize multiple perspectives.
They are a philosophical titan.
They are. But here's the brutal reality check. They are still human. The data will be flawed. The variables will shift unpredictably. The execution will stumble. No matter how wise they are going to make a catastrophic mistake.
Inevitably.
So what happens when the prince gets it wrong? This brings us to the ultimate crucible of true authority.
This is where the entire philosophical edifice either holds or shatters. The concept of accountability in leadership. Pike is unforgiving on this metric. With absolute power comes absolute accountability.
And again, this feels entirely counter to our historical conditioning. Since the dawn of civilization, the very first instinct of failed leader is deflection.
Oh, always. Find a scapegoat immediately.
We have watched monarchs, generals, and CEOs instinctively scramble to find that scapegoat, to bury the evidence, or to blame the unpredictable nature of the market.
The pervasive belief is that infallibility equals strength.
Right. If you admit you were wrong, you show weakness, the wolves smell blood, and you lose the throne. So how on earth does a leader embrace deep accountability without rendering themselves politically vulnerable to their enemies?
By understanding that vulnerability is the only mechanism that prevents systemic collapse.
Wait, really? How does vulnerability prevent collapse?
We have to examine the mechanics of infallibility. If a leader operates under the delusion that they cannot be wrong or cannot be seen as wrong, then when a strategy inevitably fails, they cannot course correct.
Because to change the strategy is to admit the initial strategy was flawed.
Precisely. So the entire organization or the entire nation is forced to continue pouring blood and treasure into a doomed endeavor solely to protect the psychological fragility of the leader.
Wow. We saw this in the trenches of World War I, where generals refused to alter their tactics despite catastrophic losses, because to change tactics was to admit failure.
The refusal of accountability doesn't merely result in a mistake. It ensures total systemic failure.
It literally weaponizes the leader's ego against the very people they're supposed to protect.
Yes. Conversely, transparent accountability is the ultimate demonstration of true power.
It requires an immense, almost terrifying degree of internal fortitude for a leader to stand before a shattered organization and say, I analyzed the data, I made the decision, and I was wrong. The ensuing damage is my responsibility, and I own it entirely.
And when a leader actually has the spine to do that, the cultural shift within the organization is seismic.
I've seen this in high-stakes corporate turnarounds. When a CEO stands up and owns a failure without caveats, no buts, no blaming the macroeconomic climate.
The team doesn't lose respect for them. Their respect actually skyrockets.
Exactly. The underlying psychology is that the team suddenly realizes this person values the truth and the survival of the group more than their own image.
It creates an impenetrable foundation of trust. And more importantly, it establishes a culture of psychological safety.
If the apex leader is willing to admit failure, then the frontline managers and citizens are no longer terrified to admit their own localized errors.
Problems are identified and solved rapidly in the light, rather than rotting in the dark, because people are too afraid to bring bad news to the throne.
The moment a leader hides a mistake, they signal to the entire hierarchy that survival depends on deception.
The whole society becomes a labyrinth of mirrors and lies, which leads us directly into the final, profound requirement, ethical leadership as the operating system, not just a PR strategy.
Ethical integrity is the summation of the prince's character. In Pike's esoteric framework, ethics are not a luxury you indulge in when the treasury is full and the borders are secure.
No, ethics are the load-bearing pillars of the temple. Acting with integrity means your decisions align with universal moral principles, especially when that alignment requires immense personal or political sacrifice.
It is incredibly easy to be an ethical leader when ethics align with profitability or popularity.
Oh, anyone could do that.
The true test, the defining moment of the prince, is when ethics demand that you take a profound loss. When doing the right thing means losing the election, or bankrupting the company, or angering your closest allies.
And that leads us to the ultimate metric by which this entire philosophy judges a human life. It is perhaps the most profound concept in the entire text.
The Prince of Jerusalem is judged not by the magnitude of the power they accumulated, but entirely by how that power was applied.
I want to pause and just let that sit for a second because it fundamentally detonates the modern paradigm of success.
You are judged not by the power you hold, but by how that power is used.
Our entire civilization is built on the gamification of accumulation. He who dies with the most toys, the highest title, the largest empire wins.
History books are largely dedicated to men who hoarded immense power, regardless of the blood spilled to get there.
But this esoteric blueprint looks at the conqueror who subjugated millions for his own glory and categorizes him as an utter failure, a spiritual infant.
It strips away all the vanity and pageantry of authority. It is the great equalizer.
You could ascend to the highest office in global politics. But if you wield that leverage to oppress the vulnerable, to enrich your sycophants, and to insulate your own ego, you have failed the initiation of life.
You are a tyrant, which in this framework is the lowest form of human evolution.
Conversely, you could be a middle school principal, a night shift supervisor, or a local community organizer. But if you wield your limited sphere of influence with absolute justice, if you balance your authority with profound empathy, and if you bear the burden of your mistakes with transparent accountability.
You are perfectly embodying the archetype of the Prince of Jerusalem.
Exactly. It democratizes greatness. It means the profound, heroic work of societal architecture is accessible to every single person listening right now, regardless of the size of their kingdom.
So let's synthesize this massive architectural journey we've just undertaken. We started in the ruins of the ego, demanding that the true leader must sever the biological imperative of self-preservation to embrace the burden of public responsibility.
We recognize that good intentions are a mirage without the cold, uncompromising engine of objective justice and absolute consistency.
We navigated the terrifying tightrope walk, avoiding the rot of authoritarianism and the chaos of cowardice through dynamic balance.
We defined wisdom not as raw data, but as the empathetic synthesis of long-term consequences and conflicting perspectives.
And finally, we anchored the entire structure to the bedrock of radical accountability and ethical sacrifice.
It is an agonizingly rigorous path. It requires the constant, daily death of the leader's own pride.
But as the philosophy suggests, it is the only structural framework that prevents human societies from devouring themselves. So we want to turn this immense philosophical mirror directly toward you, the listener. We've spent the last hour dissecting the anatomy of power, but abstract philosophy is useless until it survives contact with your reality.
Think about your own life, your own domains, however large or small they might be.
If you were suddenly handed absolute, unchecked authority tomorrow, what would you actually do with it? When you strip away the polite fictions you tell yourself, would your decisions genuinely benefit the collective, or would you quietly begin building a fortress to protect your own ego?
And on a fiercely practical level, look at the people you manage, the family you lead, or the community you influence. Are you applying justice consistently, or are you shielding your favorites under the guise of loyalty?
Do you have the internal spine to admit when you have driven the ship off course, or are you currently forcing others to suffer the consequences of your unacknowledged mistakes?
Those are brutal, illuminating questions. They require a level of uncomfortable introspection that most people spend their entire lives avoiding.
It's a lot to process.
And what is truly mesmerizing about Pike's philosophical architecture is that the mastery of the Prince of Jerusalem is still not the final destination.
Wait, really? It's not the end?
Not at all.
Yeah.
It is merely the preparation for an even more complex cognitive evolution. In our next deep dive into this material, we will step into the 17th degree, the night of the East and West.
Oh man, if this was just the preparation, what psychological crucible does the night of the East and West throw us into?
Well, if the Prince of Jerusalem is about establishing external justice and surviving the burden of power, the night of the East and West forces us to confront profound internal paradoxes. It is the realm of duality.
Duality. Okay, I'm intrigued.
It explores how a truly enlightened mind can hold two violently opposing forces, the East and the West, the spiritual and the material, the divine and the human, without psychologically fracturing.
It takes the kinetic tightrope walk we discussed today and elevates it to a cosmic scale.
Exactly.
I cannot wait to tear into that. The capacity to hold opposing truths without breaking feels like the ultimate superpower in our hyperpolarized world. But before we close the book today, I want to leave everyone with one final, lingering thread to pull on.
Let's hear it.
We have spent this entire session deconstructing the illusion of control. We've established that true power isn't a steering wheel, it is a watchtower. It's murky, it's exhausting, and it demands the relentless sacrifice of your own comfort for the safety of those below you.
Which forces us to confront a paradigm-shifting conclusion about the very nature of ambition.
If true power is never found in domination, but rather in the rigorous application of justice and the agonizing assumption of responsibility for others.
Does that mean the ultimate expression of leadership is, in fact, the ultimate expression of servitude?
The highest form of leadership is the absolute highest form of service.
And if we truly internalize that, how does it completely incinerate our modern understanding of what it means to climb to the top? If reaching the apex of power simply means you have volunteered to carry the heaviest, most unglamorous load for the rest of humanity, why do we still worship the crown?
It shatters the illusion entirely. You aren't climbing the mountain to plant your flag. You are climbing the mountain to take the watch so the rest of the camp can sleep safely.
The authority isn't there to control the passengers. It is the heavy burden of navigating the ship through the storm.
And honestly, if you view power through that lens, I don't think you can ever look at leadership the